podcast, we're looking at the SBC in crisis in a way of looking back at what's just happened at the annual meeting that met in Indianapolis last week for a couple of days. We're not going to have time to be able to cover all of the issues that came up. Most folks who haven't been to a convention don't realize the magnitude of all the things that are handled, everything from resolutions to motions that are brought to the floor. And then there, sermons and messages and some worship time, that kind of thing as well. But it's an enormous volume of items that's taken care of. And most folks only get kind of a snippet picture of what happened, and oftentimes very inaccurately, because the media almost always portrays something that was done in a resolution or a motion. And most of the time, they don't really understand how Southern Baptists work. And so it's a little bit confusing exactly how they misrepresent, we'll say, Southern Baptists. Well, today, to join me in our discussion, I have another pastor joining me, actually an Alaska pastor, Jacob Whitaker. And Jacob, we're glad to have you joining us today. I'm glad that you're able to take a little bit of time to come on board. Jacob is a bivocational pastor there in Alaska, and so we're glad to have him joining us today.
Thanks, Bobby.
Well, we are going to look at a number of different topics that we are going to be evaluating today. There's no way to cover everything that was talked about at the convention for sure, but we are going to talk about the law amendment, the issues with financial transparency that have been talked about quite a bit for the last few years. 4 or 5 years at the minimum. We're going to talk about the motion to abolish the ERLC, the ARITF report, which was the sexual abuse report, and kind of what happened with that as well. The North American Mission Board, there was a motion brought to evaluate the legal filings. We want to look at that and talk about that a little bit. And we may jump on to a couple of other things, just depends on how we feel once we get going here, Jacob. So as we get going, but let's start. One of the big things that was much anticipated to start with was the issue of the Great Commission Review Task Force. Great Commission was approved by the convention back in 2010, in June of 2010, and began implementation soon thereafter. Were you happy, pleased, discontent with this task force review and their report? Any thoughts or comments right off the bat about that, Jacob?
I didn't have any particular thoughts or comments. I admittedly followed some of the other issues that were particularly important to me. And I think I did see a couple of clips as it related to the GCR, but nothing that really stood out to me that was particularly problematic or that I felt was particularly important.
Yeah, I was glad that they had done a good number of interviews with people that had been doing research. For instance, Chuck Kelly, his book that was published, Randy Adams, several others that they had talked to. I was saddened that there was not more directive. There was not more prescriptive kind of actions that were laid out. We need to do this to see a change, because most all of the metrics are going the wrong direction. This year we did see some uptick, like in baptisms and a few of those things, but that still doesn't take away. I mean, if you compare that not just year to year, but decade to decade, you'll see the enormous drop that we've seen in almost all the metrics. And so it just seemed to me that there definitely need to be a redirection of what is going on relative to what has been implemented with the Great Commission Task Force. I think it will be very interesting to see what is in all of the things that have been put into the secret, have been vaulted, I guess you could say, for the 15 years after the task force first brought their recommendation for the GCR. The effort was made by this task force to try to get that, to be able to include some of that in what they were reporting back. But they said that was not possible to be done at this point, but that should come out in 2025. And so it will be interesting to see exactly what comes out of that task force report. I don't know that there's much more that we can say related to that, at this point. Transparency was, again, one of the big issues that kept surfacing and has surfaced over and over. what really stood out to you as far as this particular meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention related to the transparency issues?
I think the concern is just the unwillingness for transparency, and that inevitably causes concern from anybody who's giving tithes or offerings to, the convention in any capacity. It raises red flags, even if there isn't anything happening behind the scenes. We don't know, and there is no way of knowing, no mechanism for the way of knowing. And so, when you feel, obligated to steward God's, money, particularly within the context of the church, that raises a lot of concerns, and it causes churches to want to withhold funds in those circumstances. And I think they rightfully should, because if we're called to be stewards of God's resources, then we need to know where those resources are going and what they're being used for.
Yeah, I fully agree. My guess is in the church where you're pastor, people know how the money's being spent. And same thing in church where I'm transitional pastor right now, and every church I've ever pastored, that's been very clear. In fact, I'm just thinking back. I mean, I served in an association for a decade, worked in the state convention as the executive director. All of those levels of participation and cooperation in the SBC, we were very open and transparent about how the money was being spent. And it is quite disturbing, at this point to see the lack of transparency. I don't think anybody is really calling for let's see every check kind of transparency. That's not necessary particularly, but there are some real concerns. One of the things that tied back into transparency that really jumped to the forefront in this particular year was an issue that arose with, well, let's just say the North American Mission Board's booth. And they've been in the news a lot anyway, a lot of things going on. But let me show a quick clip, and then let's talk a little bit about how this surfaced and exactly what it says to us about what's happening in the SBC and particularly at the North American Mission Board.
You can go also by our booth if you'd like. We have a race car there, and we're open to giving anyone $10,000 if you can get it started, all right? Doesn't have a motor.
Once again, this was an issue. Of course, initially, some were saying that NAMB had basically sponsored a car, which I never really thought that. I thought that would be insane, and that's buku hundreds of dollars. I don't know if that's a real phrase or not, but that's a lot of money. But the questions did start coming back. I mean, that's something that, especially being located in Indy, a lot of big trade shows come into the convention center, other kinds of things. There are groups that do rentals of this kind of thing. And that eventually was what surfaced, is that this was a rental, but a huge amount of cost involved in something like this, everything from the design of what's being put on that car, but the wrap and everything else. And as you saw in that very brief clip with a few photos, it said powered by Annie Armstrong on it, and of course the NAMB logo, that kind of thing. And so many were concerned that Annie Armstrong dollars were being spent for this. I kind of feel like the marketing approach, the idea was, hey, you give to Annie Armstrong and we're all about, sending missionaries, a little bit more holistic. I don't think it was just trying to say that this was spent from Annie Armstrong money. Because, of course, 100% of what is given to Annie Armstrong is supposed to go directly to the field. The problem is the lack of transparency, and people question that. People question, is all of our money going there? Because NAMB has been so secretive about exactly how they're, spending the money, whether it be 60 million, 80 million, 90 million, 100 million that's being put into the coffers as far as church planting. How is that being spent? Well, we have gotten reports about millions of dollars being spent on houses and providing houses, some of them quite luxury. In Arizona, I think there was a house that was $750,000, had a huge pool in the backyard and all that. I mean, just a lot of just kind of insane things. And then the evidence has come out that some of those expenditures has not been really for church planters, and it wasn't in the Sin Cities, et cetera, et cetera. So, I could go on. There's a lot of issues about this, but the real key was the issue of transparency and not being willing to say, well, this was what our budget was for the convention, and this is what we spent. This was all within what we budgeted for that at that point. What was your thoughts? What was your impression about this particular issue?
Yeah, when just kind of like what you're articulating there, that it was kind of a perfect storm of it should have been a little bit on their part, that should have been a little more prudent, a little more wise as to maybe their choice of marketing. I'm not opposed to marketing at all. Even in this context, it isn't that there's anything wrong with marketing and getting our attention, helping raise funds for particular goals, and helping to communicate what your role is, and funding church planting, for instance, or say, or at the IMB, we were going for missions. You're promoting these sorts of things, and that's good. It's not necessarily bad in of itself, but the timing was really terrible. It almost makes you wonder if they realize the concerns that others are having as it relates to the transparency, particularly with NAMB, especially wondering how much people are being paid, or as some of the examples you were giving as well. And it just was really bad timing. I think there was probably some assumptions made by others looking outside, and how much was being spent on the car. And I don't know how much was spent. I was following via Twitter and watching people taking pictures of it and making comments on it. And it seemed like little bits of information of, not having an engine in the car, and that it was rented, and things like that were making it maybe less of an egregious issue than it was initially made to be. But it probably wasn't the wisest of marketing moves on their part, given the time.
Yeah, especially the high sensitivity of people who are so concerned about how the money's being spent and what we've not been able to find out. I mean, just like the salaries of the entity heads and, all those kind of things. And that kind of goes back to the Rhett Burns motion that was presented last year, was sent to the EC, which is a normal kind of procedure to send things over to the EC or to the entity to be dealt with. And the EC looked at it, evaluated it several different times. In their February meeting, they refused to act on it, postponed acting on it until their June meeting, which is right before the convention, obviously, or the annual meeting. And then they decided not to bring it to the floor for action. And it basically was asking for 990 level type transparency, which incidentally, if people don't know, this is the normal kind of filing, transparent filing that nonprofit organizations do all the time. It is filed with the IRS, and many organizations like take Franklin Graham's organization, Billy Graham organization, those kinds of organizations, they all file a 990. So you can go and find it. It's public record. Nobody was asking, including Rhett Burns in his motion, that this be made a filing to the IRS. He's just asking for similar type revelation, transparency, just like Planned Parenthood or any other nonprofit has to do, that at least our entities would be at least that forthcoming. IMB president Paul Chitwood came out and basically said, hey, look, we don't want to support that at all because it would put our missionaries in danger. And Burns has been very, very clear that is not the case. And they're not asking for those locations of missionaries or what every missionary makes to be revealed. But the top executives, yes. What about grants being received? That would be something should be revealed. Are there outside funds coming in? What's the ties with that? And, the Center for Baptist Leadership, the new Center for Baptist Leadership led by William Wolf, actually did a kind of a parallel. It wasn't part of the SBC per se, wasn't SBC sponsored, but it was around the SBC so people could attend, and some 800 or 900 people were in attendance and heard Megan Basham, the reporter from Daily Wire, who presented content from her forthcoming book, but much of the ties tying the ERLC to a lot of kind of questionable funding, money that's coming in, sponsoring grants and research and other kinds of things. So I think it was just an insensitive move, understanding it's very expensive to do this kind of a trade show, set up those displays that all of the organizations that display put up. It's not cheap, but it seemed like this particular part of the display, even though it tied in with Indy. They should have done a paper mache race car or something. I don't know, something that obviously didn't look quite so expensive, I guess you could say, at that point. Well, let's talk about the motion that was brought to evaluate the legal filings of the North American Mission Board. This was a motion that was brought by a pastor with the intent of trying to help the Southern Baptist Convention as a whole, but those in the annual meeting, to present and create this task force to evaluate what many are saying is a misrepresentation of who we are as Southern Baptists. Let's look real quickly at the arguments that were made, and then I want to get your comment on the other side of this. All right?
Joel Breidenbaugh, messenger of Gospel-Centered Church in Apopka, Florida. So the reason I made my motion is that this entity matters to SBC missions. There's a number of things we don't know, but we do know that the SBC must speak clearly to the courts about our polity, lest we damage ourselves. It's enormously dangerous for one SBC entity to make claims in the courts that impact the entire SBC, all its entities, its mission gifts, ministry partners in local churches, associations, and state conventions. What has actually happened at the Fifth Corporate Circuit is legal precedent for other current and future lawsuits that relate to Baptist bodies and ministers. You may remember that in 2019, the ERLC made false statements to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals by saying the SBC was a hierarchy and the SBC was the umbrella organization over all other Baptist organizations and churches. NAMB has made its own troubling statements, including that a state executive director was actually an employee of an SBC entity. Furthermore, NAMB wrote in their defense to the Federal District Court of North Mississippi in November 2018 and December 2022 that NAMB had the legal right to interfere to protect its own economic and other interests. They argued that NAMB is protected by an absolute privilege with regard to any statements it may have made regarding plaintiffs. NAMB said they were protected by an absolute privilege and or a qualified privilege with respect to all decisions it made and or actions it took, which may have related to other dismissals. Dr. Barry Hankins, Baptist historian, professor, and expert witness, says in his expert report, if NAMB's interpretation of the First Amendment prevailed, every Baptist entity that cooperates in any way with the SBC will be put at risk. Furthermore, he said, it is my opinion, as a scholar of church-state relations in the U.S., that NAMB's First Amendment defense in this case, if accepted by courts, would actually undermine religious liberty rather than safeguard it. We've had over 230 Baptist leaders sign a letter claiming there's an existential threat in the SBC, and as we stood watching, the autonomy of Baptist churches, organizations, and ministers have been hijacked by the North American Mission Board. Thank you.
Microphone 1A, please state your name and your church, and we recognize you to speak against the motion.
Thanks, Mr. President. My name is Josh Revis. I'm a messenger from North Jacksonville Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Florida. Longtime listener, first-time caller. Just wanted to say this motion is both unnecessary and unproductive. I've been a trustee at NAMB since 2022. Motion is unnecessary because any Southern Baptist may already review every word of NAMB's public legal filings and oral arguments, and NAMB would welcome that. It's also unproductive. These task forces have a twofold cost. They cost regular Southern Baptists who get appointed their uncompensated time away from other things. It also costs CP dollars to fund them. And this matter that's at the center of this motion is pending currently. It's not complete. And so any study would be premature at this stage and its findings would be incomplete. And I don't have any personal swag to give anybody, but I would like to give back 2 minutes and 8 seconds to the people. Thank you.
Microphone 5A, would you state your name and your church and make your argument, please?
Jonathan Jarbo, messenger from Pathway Church in Redlands, California. I also serve as a trustee as NAMB, and I just want to echo what Josh said and believe this motion is unproductive and will use cooperative program resources. The issue is still pending, and so a review at this point would be incomplete at best, and so I oppose the motion.
Josh, let me get your initial thoughts. What are your thoughts to their arguments at this point?
You know, I agree with the spirit of the motion made initially, because I have the similar concerns just through the grapevine and watching what I've watched, listened to what I've listened, and read what I've read, and not being able to get necessarily in the weeds here. But it does concern me that if there's something that NAMB is doing on the behalf of other churches that then subjects us to potential lawsuits in the future or liabilities that we may be caught unaware by, I think that's very concerning. And I think that's right to identify those things as he has there on the floor. And now the hard question for me is how do we, what ought we to do about it? How do we bring accountability? How do we rectify the situation, determine whether the risk is real, how real it is, and then what to do about it? That's a challenging question. That's obviously what the other messengers were coming against, that this is an unnecessary way of going about doing anything about it. They were also minimizing the issue, and I think that's wrong. And I'm up for debate as to how to tackle the issue, but I'm certainly in agreement with the spirit of the initial motion made on the floor.
Yeah, and of course, this is where they're speaking to it. It's not when they made the initial motion, but the two that responded to say, "Hey, we don't need this motion," opposing it, they both were trustees of the North American Mission Board, and in my view, it kind of sounded like they're just pulling the party line. Okay, to some extent, they used some phrasing which maybe their legal counsel or somebody else helped them put together and make sure they were saying this a certain way, but they used the phrasing, "This is unnecessary." They said that the motion is unproductive. They said this is an issue that's still pending. Well, the motion, if I understand it, the motion wasn't about what's still pending. The resolution of the case is still pending because it's waiting on a response from the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court, and this is in the McRaney versus North American Mission Board case. So the case is pending. The issue for the motion is not still pending. The issue of the motion is we want to have evaluated the arguments that the North American Mission Board has made to the courts, and understand this is multiple courts. It's been done to the Northern District, the U.S. Northern District Court. It has to do with the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court the first time, and now the second time, as they've said, there's an implied consent that NAMB has basically authority over a state convention through implied consent governance, and then also to the Supreme Court. North American Mission Board took it to the Supreme Court. And so the motion was, hey, look, none of that's pending. This is all documents that are publicly available and are now there. And they're saying, well, there's no reason to mess with that. You can look at it if you want to. We encourage you to do that. But this is not something that needs to be done right now, which is of real concern to me for a lot of reasons. Let me put up a slide that Randy Chestnut, a pastor in Ohio, put together. And we've shown this before on this channel. We have some other information about this, but some of the NAMB defenses that raise question, and this is part of what the motion was intending to have reviewed, I think, in these court cases from 2018 and 2022. NAMB had the legal right to interfere to protect its own economic interests. The pastor who was speaking for it brought out this. The 12th defense, you see there, NAMB is protected by an absolute privilege with regard to any statements it may have published regarding the plaintiff, meaning McCraney. 13th defense, they're qualified by privilege with regard to any statements it may have published. 15th, plaintiff was a public figure within the meaning of the law, defamation, and therefore bears the burden of proof imposed upon public figures. And then the 16th defense, they say NAMB is protected by an absolute privilege and or qualified privilege with respect to all decisions it made or actions it took which may relate to or had effect upon the plaintiff's employment with the Baptist Convention of Maryland, Delaware. That's what he's wanting reviewed. That's the issue at hand. None of that's pending. Those were all taken directly out of court documents. And then, of course, the arguments, like I just mentioned, that were just made before the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court on the 4th of April, those, is that right? 4th of April? Yeah, I believe that's right. Or May. I think it was April. But when those arguments were made, they argued that there was an implied consent that they needed to abide by what basically the North American Mission Board's governance was, which doesn't line up at all. I mean, what are your other thoughts about that? I mean, do you think like this doesn't need to be dealt with at all until this case is settled?
No, the trustees' response that were given there in that particular clip definitely make you feel dismissive. You'll also notice in each of their they like to throw a joke in there at the beginning or the end of what they're saying. It's almost like to try to soften things or to make it seem less significant or serious. Because the first, when the gentleman's speaking on his motion, he's very serious and very concerned. And then when you throw jokes in your brief little testimony there, that and he's speaking also to it, that it makes it feel like you're being dismissive of the concern, and that raises red flags for me. And so, yeah, it feels very dismissive on their part.
Yeah, it's very difficult in this kind of a setting. I mean, there were, I don't know how many messengers were in the room at this particular time of argument. That was on a Wednesday morning, I believe. But there were probably, 8, 9, 10,000 people, sitting in the room. And it is very difficult, to try to present in that kind of a setting. But my initial response when I looked and listened to the arguments, the NAMB trustees were very short, to the point, had a couple of talking points. They both kind of hit on those. It needs to be defeated because, right? And the one speaking for, it kind of got muddied to me. It got a little muddied in trying to present it, wanting to get a lot of facts in, get that information in. But it didn't seem to be near as impactful as what I think it really is, trying to help those messengers present understand this is a significant issue. And let me tell you why. We've talked about this a little bit before in some other conversations, but their arguments are building a connectivity with Southern Baptists. And in the sex abuse cases, in other kinds of lawsuits, any kind of case, when you start trying to connect, say, any of the entities or have some type of a hierarchical role, there's a connectivity between them, then when there's a lawsuit against a local church about whatever it may be an abuse case, but it could be simply somebody fell down the stairs going out of your church on a Sunday morning and go back and look at it. They realize, well, hey, that handstand's just a little bit loose. The handrail is a little bit loose, and I fell because I grabbed that and I slipped when I fell and it wasn't steady, and I'm going to sue your church. Well, if there's that connectivity there, then the lawyer's going to say, well, I'm also going to sue that local association that you're a part of, and I'm going to sue your state convention there in Alaska, and I'm going to sue the entire Southern Baptist Convention because they're all connected. See, there's this connectivity, and the arguments that have been made, the ERLC before the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court last time used that term hierarchy in their arguments, and then North American Mission Board making many of these arguments, saying that they have a right, they have the privilege of doing that, whether they chose to or not. To me, is creating a legal precedent in ways that are going to be extremely dangerous and hazardous to Southern Baptists down the road in all kinds of cases, not just related to abuse and not just related to the defamation claims and other claims of interference that McRaney is making toward NAMB.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, it's just a real concern to me, without any doubt. Well, let's move on. Another one of the big issues that came up was issues related to what was termed the law amendment. This was an issue related to women pastors. This was brought back to the floor in 2023 in New Orleans last year, and it passed in the convention meeting room at that point with about, I think it was like 83%, something like that, passed. And so proponents of this amendment is named after basically Mike Law, who's the guy who proposed it. And the issue basically at hand was, hey, there are too many churches that have women pastors now, and we're complementarian. We don't believe in egalitarian theology as such, where women should be serving as pastors. And understand there are other groups, denominations that's no problem. They fully adhere to women pastors. They don't have a problem with women overseers and that kind of thing. But Southern Baptists have never been in that line and have always lined up with a complementarian view. And there's lots of arguments. We're not going to try to get into all the arguments on both sides of this, but it is one of the issues that came out. And so once it was brought back to the floor this time, there was some anticipation that it had a good chance of passing because last year it was 83%. What was your initial thought about this particular issue? I tell you what, I've got a clip. Let's look at the clip first about the law amendment, and then let me get your comment on the other side. All right?
Sounds good.
My name is Spence Shelton. I serve as the lead pastor of Mercy Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. The question before us today is not whether or not we're complementarian. That's clear. The question is not, do we believe the Bible? That's also clear. We are complementarian. We believe the Scripture. The question is this amendment necessary for our convention to respond when churches in our convention act in a way contrary to our complementarian doctrine? We showed last year we have an effective mechanism. It allows us to act with conviction, and unity when it comes to this issue. Last year, we removed 2 different churches, one really big, like a mega church, one normative size. This year, we removed an institutional legacy church. Y'all, we have shown that the mechanisms we currently have are sufficient to deal with this question. Listen, the last thing I want to say is I believe that we need to act in unity as a convention. The other 3 amendments that we made by raised ballot, and it was an overwhelmingly majority referendum on this issue. So I want to risk something, if you will, to my fellow brothers and sisters, because this has been weighing on me a whole lot. Would you be willing, if this goes to a written ballot, to see that as our message that we're not unified when it comes to this issue? If we all raise overwhelming majority, let it be so. But if not, if this goes to a written ballot, maybe that's our signal that we are not unified as Southern Baptists. And why would we go forward with something that we are not unified in? I love that we are unified in the Great Commission. We are unified in our biblical convictions. Let us go forward in those and vote down this amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Okay. Also at microphone 10A, but this time to speak in favor of the amendment. Please state your name, your church, and your argument.
Thank you, Mr. President. My name is Mike Law, and I'm a messenger from Arlington Baptist Church. I rise to support this motion because it is faithful to God's inerrant word. Southern Baptists love the Bible and long to be faithful to the Bible. In 1987, there were 18 women serving as pastors in the Southern Baptist churches. Last year, we learned there were over 1,800. This is a problem. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 12 to 14, the all-wise God says that a woman ought not teach or exercise authority over a man, terms associated with the pastoral office. Our culture may see this prohibition as harsh, But our God is all wise, and he wrote his word for the flourishing of both men and women. Our Baptist faith and message agrees. While both men and women are gifted for service in the church, the office of pastor, elder, overseer is limited to men as qualified by Scripture. Let's be exceptionally clear. We gladly celebrate the myriads of women who serve the church in many essential ways. We are so grateful for these godly sisters. This amendment is not about women in ministry. It's specifically about women in the pastoral office. Last year, we rightly stood on the truth of Scripture and adopted this amendment. Many things have changed since last year, but one thing has not changed. God's word remains the same. The Bible still teaches that the office of pastor is reserved for qualified men. Other denominations have failed here. Even this year, we have seen the United Methodists collapse into unbiblical chaos. Brothers and sisters, for the glory of God, we must side with Scripture. Last year, we voted for biblical faithfulness. Yesterday, we voted for biblical faithfulness. Today, let us vote for biblical faithfulness. Tomorrow and every day, let us vote for biblical faithfulness until we hand this convention over to the next generation to vote for biblical faithfulness. This amendment is faithful to Scripture. This amendment makes clear that the pastoral office is reserved for biblically qualified men. This amendment announces our unity in God's word to build churches according to God's design. In conclusion, I encourage you to vote yes for this amendment, to adopt this amendment, and stand with the unchanging word of our good and wise God. And I move the previous question.
Your thoughts there?
Oh, it's honestly, it's very frustrating to watch because, watching from afar, the impression that I get or have gotten over the years is that because of the increase, and while the number overall, we were talking earlier offline, while the number overall is small in comparison to the whole body of SBC, he rightly highlights there how much the increase has been in such a short period of time, which is reminiscent of a potentially real problem. And one of those problems is that we're not holding the doctrinal line when it comes to affiliation with churches and having a fellowship that's grounded in doctrinal clarity and fidelity. Because our outreach, our evangelism is fundamentally rooted in what we believe. Otherwise, are we evangelizing the same thing? Are we teaching the same thing when we make disciples? And so, those things matter. And what he's pointing out, and what I think what the reason the law amendment existed was because, if I'm remembering correctly, it's the credentialing committee that takes this up. As it relates to disfellowshipping churches that you don't agree on our core Baptist faith and message statement of faith, and therefore are disfellowshipped. And because they weren't taking action, that's why you have the law amendment. But then here in this convention,
the credentials committee actually basically asked the convention in that year, what is a pastor?
Exactly. And so in here, all of a sudden, this year, all of a sudden, supposedly it's very clear as to what a pastor is, and we don't need the law amendment. But no, that's the very reason the law amendment came into existence. It came, brought before the convention is because they weren't taking action when they should be. And so all of a sudden, well, I guess we need something a little more clear, a little more forceful if the BFM is not enough. But then all of a sudden they're making the argument that it is enough. And I think that's what was frustrating for me to watch. He's making the argument there that, look, we've disfellowshipped some churches, and so it's working. And no, you did that because you were forced to, and your hand was forced. And so I just think it's disingenuous. And if you supposedly agree with the law amendment and everything that it's teaching, then what's the big deal about passing it? So it was very frustrating to watch.
Well, let me ask you this, and of course I've watched probably like you too. On X or Twitter, the back and forth. And I realize that's not the real world. X is kind of a little microcosm of what's really happening across the world. But do you think that the law amendment was trying to push like, legalistic, trying to be legalistic, or legalism, or what are your thoughts about that? Because obviously the Baptist Faith and Message does state, not as lengthy, obviously, but it does state and gives the biblical support as far as the scripture references and stuff, why, the convention is complementarian and not egalitarian. And some churches have been removed, but what was the number you said? 1,800, something like that. Something like, they're not 1,800 that have been brought to the credentials committee or gone. And again, back to that connectivity thing, if we have the connectivity of the executive committee and any of our entities overseeing every church, the local churches, then they're going to start going out and assertively investigating. We have to have an arm that's going to be managing and I don't know. I can see how it could lean toward legalism, and I hear the argument about, hey, the Baptist Faith Message is enough if we're following through on that. Do you think anything to the legalism, or I think I've seen some use fundamentalist, that it's a fundamentalist thing. And, you can get overly spiritual and say, well, if you believe the Bible, then yeah, okay, I'm fundamentalist. I believe the Bible, but that still goes back to what people interpret, their interpretation, whether it's fundamentalist or not. But I don't know. I'm rambling. Go ahead. Jump in there, Jacob.
I've definitely seen the label fundamentalist in my Twitter feed on social media. So I know exactly what you're talking about. And I think it's more playing the man than it is playing the ball. Unfortunately, I think that's really what it is. So I find it kind of frustrating, but I'm happy to wear the label fundamentalist if that means being faithful to the Bible. And do I wish the Baptist Faith and Message were enough? Absolutely. I mean, watch Dr. Moeller from a couple of years ago, and he's saying, do we really need a credentials committee to figure out what a pastor is? Like, at what point is this ridiculous? And so yeah, I think that the fundamentalist critique is not a valid one. It's playing the man rather than the ball.
Okay. Well, one of the reasons that this became as big of an issue as it did is because of some of the revelations that have come out in the last few years about particularly the North American Mission Board having connections directly to churches that have women as pastors. And that's been a big issue. Again, back with the transparency, much of that has been denied over and over and over. But let's watch this brief kind of clip about this particular issue as it ties back to the North American Mission Board.
We plant churches with male pastors. We have over 11,071 churches that have been planted since 2010, and every one of those has a male pastor. The challenge with the BGCT, and I want to clear up the murky. I've shared with your state exec, which the new state exec there, and we've had a great relationship with David Hartage as well, was the previous. This is nothing new. We've continually gone by the exact same Baptist Faith and Message 2000.
So if that's the case, does that really play out? Let me show you a few other things that have surfaced. Now, you heard what Kevin Ezell just said. He said that they totally align with all their plants with the Baptist Faith and Message, and they aren't connected with churches that basically have a woman pastor. Tom Buck published a number of things online where he was giving evidence of NAMB supporting and being connected to churches that had women pastors. This was a packet he put together and he sent directly to Kevin Ezell. I have talked to Tom, and he sent this to me and gave me the privilege of being able to just reshare it. But this is information he's already put out. These are, and I'm not going to show you this whole packet, but these are basically 6 different churches that he was able to find that were identified at one time on the NAMB website as being NAMB churches. They were part of NAMB Sin City emphasis, and you can see each of them are planted there. Initially, the Echo Church Kevin Ezell said they were planted initially beforehand, before he came on board, and that had all been taken care of, was the initial statements on that. But when we look at Echo Church, you can see here we have several that are listed as pastors, and these individuals, in fact, this Stacy Wood right here in that lower right corner. Stacy Wood is the wife of Pastor Andy Wood, who was the, as we would say, lead pastor or the senior pastor. And they have her listed as a teaching pastor. They eventually went to be the pastors, use that plural, at Saddleback Church. And this happened right around the convention time last year when Rick Warren was opposing that. Further, here's another one of those. This is from the NAMB research on female pastors that Buck did. Grace City Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Notice it says lead pastors, both of them. And this is a screenshot taken from the NAMB website at the time. Here's Grace City Church, and it lists them there as a NAMB funded church. Again, so more concern. Not going to show a whole bunch more of these, but let me just show you a couple more. Here's the board of elders for this particular church. This church, Grace Point Church, if I remember right, had some 25 or 30 different locations at this time. And here you'll see several of these women that are listed as pastors or elders on the board of elders. Here's one woman listed by herself in that role as well. Here's another one. This particular screenshot, again, this is taken from their website. The husband and wife both listed as the pastors, and the wife is identified there. I don't know if you can see the yellow highlight there in the middle of the paragraph. She's listed as an elder. And here are from the NAMB website, again, showing where that church is located at that point. One final illustration, this again from his research, the Gallery Church there in Baltimore, Maryland. They're showing Cricket here, as well as a few others that are listed as pastors. Here is scroll down a little bit more, and you'll see these other names of pastors and elders, Linda and Dorina. No, Dina, I'm not sure how she says that, but irrelevant how she pronounces it. They're listed as pastors as well. So these are real concerns. This is just some of the information that's been put out there. In fact, one of them that I didn't put in there is, I don't remember her first name, but last name was Santos. Somebody's Rachel Santos. But anyway, she's part of the Echo Church, where she was listed as a pastor as well. And North American Mission Board did training at that location. And the husband was one of the trainers employed as a send missionary to help train church planters. And his wife is listed as one of their teaching elders as well, a teaching pastor. So some of this kind of evidence that has been floating around about the North American Mission Board, again, has brought real concern about what is actually happening there at the North American Mission Board. Your thoughts, Jacob?
Yeah, it's obviously very concerning to me. You know, one of the things that the Southern Baptist Convention has struggled with largely is we focus on numbers a lot. And I think we shouldn't do that to the degree that we do. It leads to kind of a pragmatic approach to the gospel. It leads to a pragmatic approach to church planting. And pragmatism always leads to compromise, because it's concerned always about the ends, and it doesn't care as much about how to get to the ends. It ends up pitting doctrine against evangelism, which is we can talk about it later if you like, but it just it's just ridiculous to go down these roads. And I think that's what you see in even in an example like this, is a desire for numbers, a desire for whether it's numbers of people being baptized or churches being planted. There's a desire to accomplish that goal. And so the doctrine ends up getting compromised in those. And I think you saw from the meeting there that there's an attempt to have your foot on both sides of the fence. Like, we're trying to remain, we're doctrinally, faithful on one hand, but at the same time, when you go and look, that's not necessarily what you're seeing. And it's crazy to me that they actually, at some point, these things are very obvious if anyone's paying attention. And I think that's hard. I think at least I can speak for myself as a bivocational pastor. I just don't have a lot of time to keep track of what's going on sometimes. And so I depend upon a lot of others who have more time or are in that area, and they're pointing these things out. So I really appreciate that. But yeah, when I see these things, it's very concerning to watch that. And then it's kind of concerning then to watch the leaders in NAMB when they get it during the convention, and they're not acknowledging it. They're not explaining it. They're not, apologizing for it. They're not repenting of it or any of those sorts of things. They're just obfuscating and pretending to be clear, which to me seems all the more, you're entrenching yourself in your initial dishonesty. And so that's just deeply concerning.
Yeah, it really is. And I should add this footnote real quick. Should have said it at the beginning, but Tom Buck told me that the stuff that I just showed you and the things that he's published online, he just wanted to make sure I knew that he had privately addressed these things individually before he ever came out and said anything publicly. He wanted them to be able to have opportunity to make corrections and to explain, what's happened and make the corrections. And really the corrections that he's acknowledged that have taken place really is just removing it from the website. It's just removing it from the NAMB website and identifying them at that point. And I mean, when I was appointed as a North American missionary, NAMB missionary, they appointed both myself and my wife. We were assigned to associational missions and church planting. But she was not assigned as an elder, a lead pastor, anything. She was a spouse of the primary assigned person. And so I don't have a problem with the North American Mission Board, saying, hey, we're commissioning not only this planter to help plant a church, and we're commissioning his wife. She's his helpmate. That's a biblical thing. That's totally fine. But she's not to be the co-pastor, as we saw in that one case, and others that Buck has found, as well as others have at this point as well. I can see with this kind of information coming out, even though, like you said, the total numbers compared to all of the Southern Baptist churches, some 47,000 churches, it's like 0.04% of churches. So it is a minuscule number if you're looking at it percentage wise. But these are churches that are highly influential. I mean, when you're talking about a church like the Echo Church that is training church planters, it is a place where church planters are taken and trained, and they are being shown, basically, hey, it's okay to have your wife as a teaching pastor. It's okay to have your wife as an elder. So I can see the reason why Mike Law and others have said, hey, look, we need to put this in the Constitution because it's not being acknowledged. It failed this year with it had to have 2/3 majority, which is 66 point whatever percent. And I think it got 63% or something like that, if my memory serves me right. So it just barely fell. Do you think this issue is over? Do you think that it's going to go away now since that failed after 2 conventions?
That's up to us, I guess. I struggle with the subject of whether to stay or whether to leave. And part of me wants to stay and fight and for biblical fidelity. And part of me, one of the reasons I want to do that is because I've watched faithful Christians jump ship whenever there is, uncertainty at the helm, if you will. And, and liberalism or leftism, progressivism, whatever you want to call it, as it infiltrates the church, they become parasites, and they take all of the assets and the resources of the church, and all of the conservatives, all of your biblically faithful Christians, they jump ship. And I'm starting to wonder, is that the path? Is that the right path? I understand wanting to be biblically faithful and frustrated with those who are not, or who are compromising, who are using, mincing their words. And that is frustrating. I get that. And so, but I wonder, I think the answer to your question is are we going to stay? Are we going to fight for it? And to one last thing there, to your point that you were mentioning is that, the problem may seem minuscule if you want to compare it to certain things, but we don't address problems after they're too big to fix. And if you do that, you will end up like the Methodist denomination. You will end up like so many of the other major denominations that have gone into the dumpster fire. And I don't want that.
Yeah, I can see without a doubt that there is a pattern, I guess you could say, without a doubt. Yeah, I'm with you. I don't think because the law amendment failed after the second time, just barely, but it did. I don't think that's a dead issue. I think it's going to resurface again. I really do think that it failed not because there were almost a third of the messengers in the room that said, no, we're fully egalitarian. Yeah, we don't want to be complementarian. Right. I think the arguments that came in several settings where key people in the convention, leaders of organizations in the convention, argued before church planners like the North American Mission Board event right before the convention, those kind of things, where they basically said from the platform, we don't need the law amendment. It's good enough, and there was enough argument that I think the majority of people in the room feel like, yeah, we're complementarian. There's no question. The question was, is it necessary to have it in the Constitution? And if we step into that, then what's the next thing we're going to want to add to the Constitution and add to the Constitution? Before long, you're trying to take all of your statement of faith, basically, and try to go through the process of adding everything to your Constitution. I don't know. It's a muddy pool, I think, that we've gotten in as far as trying to keep it clear. And that's going to be a hard thing, I think, in the future to keep it clear. Well, speaking of muddy things and the way the convention has been misrepresented, there are two other issues we're going to hit on real quickly as we close up. One of them, let's just touch on real quick, and then we're going to finish with a conversation about the IVF motion that was made. But just out of nowhere, it seemed like, I've totally drawn a blank on the guy's name that came to brought the motion to abolish the ERLC.
Tom Askell.
Yeah, Tom Askell. Oh my
Poor
soul.
Tom.
How do I forget Tom's name? Tom's a regular. He's a regular thing at the convention. But anyway, I just drew a blank. But Tom, just out of nowhere, said that he just felt compelled to go and make this motion to abolish the ERLC. The motion ended up failing. And what are your thoughts? I mean, about the ERLC and this motion to abolish the ERLC? What are your initial thoughts as just a pastor who's looking at it from the outside?
Yeah, I sympathize with Tom. I'm with him wholeheartedly. I can imagine I would have felt the same way after sitting through the session with Megan Basham as it related to just kind of exposing some of the money that appears to be driving maybe the motivations and ultimately some compromise within the ERLC, which we've been watching for many years now, especially after Russell Moore was there and now Leatherwood, and it's maddening to watch. I mean, I was watching from afar and I didn't get to see Megan's presentation. It wasn't up right away. It may be up now to watch, but and so I sympathize with Tom, and I would have voted for its abolition as well, just because I don't think it's been of value to us. I think it's actually steering us into compromise, and I don't think that's healthy. I don't think that's helpful. I don't want my money going to those sorts of, being steered that direction. And so I would have voted with Tom on that.
Yeah, I'm not opposed for the most part to the ERLC's mission. The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, and its mission, its purpose is something we really need. We need good representation. But what's happened is, my understanding, in the last decade and a half, Southern Baptists don't have the kind of voice they once had for influence on Capitol Hill. They once did. There was almost never an opportunity meeting with counsel, of those at top level from the president on down, who did not seek out the counsel of the ERLC, usually the president. While Richard Land was there were always things. People were, this is kind of like almost every other year thing. Somebody, bring a motion to abolish the ERLC. And it's because they're dealing with very difficult issues. They're dealing with literally the ethics and the moral and the difficult things that we deal with and pastors deal with in local churches on a very personal level. And they are supposed to be representing us. I think that mission is very valid. We need that. We need somebody who stands for Christian biblical principles on Capitol Hill and tries to stand up against the horrible stuff that's brought out and done there, without a doubt. My issue is what's happened to the leadership that we have in that role. I mean, my soul, once you start looking back and realize all the things that Russell Moore was doing, and then how he tried to just literally, basically blow up the convention with all of his accusations in leaving, which we've spent near $14 million on the abuse stuff that's, moved forward in this case. And that abuse task force, we got the report from them and they're basically done for now, handed it over to the EC. So, but we spent $14 million of mission giving money, for the most part, to be able to try to address what Russell Moore did. That's not a Christ-like Christian way to handle things, making false allegations and bringing lies like that. Well, our current leadership is not doing the kind of job when they've opposed the kind of legislation they did in Louisiana. That was one of the big issues that people have brought up. The Kentucky amicus brief, that they were battling about. There are lots of things that they have just not taken an approach that most of us as Christians would want to take. The other big one, I think, that really has enraged people is when the leadership of the ERLC stood up with some very, very liberal organizations to say, we don't want the manifesto, the transcript from the transgender shooter in Tennessee at the Christian school. We don't want that made public. Why not? Why would they stand against that? If anything, don't say anything. And I understand it's in Nashville and, there's some personal connections. But as an organization, most Southern Baptists were not wanting that to be kept secret. If that was an intentional attack on Christians, as it appears to be, they should be saying, hey, we need transparency there too. They didn't. I like the mission of what we stand for the ERLC, but I think we've got a real issue with leadership. And Attorney John Whitehead has been one of those trustees that has fought against many of these things from the inside, but he's not the majority right now of our trustees in that issue. So anyway, that's my 2 cents worth. I've gone to preaching.
Well, it's difficult because I can absolutely agree with the desire to want to influence our government. We should, as Christians. I think that's fundamental to that's going to happen. If we are proclaiming the gospel and making disciples of all nations, it's going to have a necessary impact. The question is an entity like an ERLC the most effective way or biblical way of doing that? That's a challenge because you don't end up as much with churchmen running that particular.
We froze on you. I think Jacob froze on us.
Did I lose you?
Oh, there you are. No, you're back now. Yeah. You just you were frozen in space.
Yeah, I got some black circles there for a minute, but yeah, I just wonder if the ERLC is the best way to accomplish that aim. We should certainly be speaking prophetically to the government, preaching the 10 Commandments, and those sorts of God's moral law to the government and the government sphere. But it seems like the ERLC is easy pickings for outside entities to steer us, and then also invite compromise, especially if we're accepting funds from those outside sources. There becomes pressure from the outside, and so that it creates a danger. And so I just wonder if the ERLC is a fundamentally flawed pursuit in the sense of how to accomplish that aim. And so
if we put it in a historical perspective, it's basically 100 years old since the ERLC was started. In its beginning, when the mission statement was very similar to what it is now, in its beginning, there weren't many organizations that were trying to have a Christian, worldview presented on Capitol Hill. There weren't many. And with Southern Baptist being the largest Protestant organization, cooperating churches together, that was needed. So there are other organizations now, and I'm not yet ready to totally cash it in, but I am frustrated with our current leadership and what's happening there. The leaders and how they're leading that at this point is a bit concerning to me, without a doubt. But anyway, let's go ahead and finish up talking about the issue of the IVF. This was the issue that came up. This was a resolution that was initially penned. I think majority of it was penned by Albert Mohler at Southern Seminary. And this is one of the issues that has been so misrepresented in the media that Southern Baptists were just totally against any kind of IVF. And, basically some of the reports I saw, it was more of a condemning, anybody who was having problems with infertility and went to this option. I didn't read it that way. I didn't see it that way. Let me share with you real quickly. Joel Rainey, who is a pastor, he once was an associational missionary appointed by the North American Mission Board, went to the state convention in Maryland, Delaware for a period of time, then left there and went to Covenant Church, where he pastors now. And he had these comments about that. This is just a thread on Twitter or X. And let me just, I want to read it and then get your response, Jacob. He says, SBC Resolution 6 on IVF is not what you're reading in the media. Read it for yourself. It's compassionate toward infertile couples and clearly declares the value of every child, regardless how they were conceived. What's making everyone uncomfortable is that it also clearly identifies ethical issues with the IVF process. Pause real second from his comments. This is one of the big things that is always difficult, and why the ERLC is in hot water a lot of times is because they're dealing with ethical issues. And when you're dealing with ethics of something, especially something like this that is so significant, it's a tough argument. I mean, you're just struggling with lots of different components that play into that. Okay, back to his comments. He said, this is an unavoidable issue for anyone who believes human life begins at conception. It makes no final condemnation of IVF and never comes close to condemning parents who have conceived children through this method. It aims criticism toward the ethicity, excuse me, I'm having a hard time saying that, the ethically problematic points in the process. And that's exactly what it should do. And I'll add this point so my bosses, the resolution mirrors almost exactly how I responded as a pastor to every situation I've encountered involving IVF. In an age where our capacity to accomplish a thing is rarely accompanied by the question of whether it ought to be undertaken, someone has to ask the ethical questions. Though I've expressed numerous strong differences in recent days with Albert Mohler and with Andrew Walk, I am grateful for their work here that provides a strong ethical baseline from which to have important discussion. I have 3 children, 24, 18, 15, and they are my great delight. Can't imagine life without them. That gratefulness is informed by an ethic that reminds me I have no right to them and that they don't exist for my self-actualization. They are on loan to me from their rightful owner, and his laws should determine not only how I raise them, but also how they become our kids from the beginning. This is a consistent Christian ethic. And regardless of how Resolution 6 is mischaracterized, that's exactly the ethic to express. Read it for yourself. I think he pretty well states a restating from a pastor's perspective of the difficulty of this issue, but clearly says there is no condemnation in this. We're struggling with the ethics of this. And just at the core is oftentimes the embryos that are fertilized. There may be 10, 12, 15 of them, and only one of them is successful and the others are destroyed. So if you believe in birth, I mean, not birth, but life starting at conception, well, then you have basically conceived in that embryo at the earliest stages, yes, but now you're destroying it. So what do you think? How do you think we need to move forward here, Jacob?
Yeah, I think IVF, oftentimes biblical fidelity is easy in the sense of discerning what's faithful. It's sometimes following through, and actually, following through with that faithfulness is challenging because there are external pressures and circumstances that make remaining faithful difficult. And so IVF, from on the face of it, is a very simple thing, especially if you just do a little research and understanding that, children are essentially being discarded in favor of one or the other throughout the process, or putting in, being frozen and then discarded later. And so these are obvious if life begins at conception. And I think that's manifestly clear. I think that's irrefutable. It's scientific, it's biblical. Everything about it is right. But obviously, I think sometimes from the side, people bring in these issues of, well, what about those who are trying to, or struggling with infertility and are using methods like these to have children? And don't we want to have children? And I think those are, we can absolutely answer those questions, especially for those who are asking them in a genuine fashion and are genuinely hurting because they can't have children or having trouble having children. And we should have compassion for those. But there's also a lot of people who are asking that question in order to silence, someone's desire to be faithful to the scriptures and to not murder and to obey God's law. And so it's going to be, we have to be those who are wanting to be faithful to, one, answer those who are legitimately asking that question, and provide them other ways. Also, number one, trusting in the Lord with these things fundamentally. But then there's going to be that outside noise that are always trying to, who don't care about whether they're compromising the word of God, but they're going to use those genuine concerns and questions to try to, push their case.
Yeah, no question. It's a touchy subject, no doubt. I've heard some political commentators on some recent broadcasts since this decision was passed, this resolution. And remember, a resolution by the annual meeting is not a dictate. Okay, we're not like the Catholic Church or some other organization that says this is what you have to do and this is what you have to believe. A resolution is a statement that's made of those messengers in the room at that moment of the meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention. So this is not a dictate, but many of those that I have heard making the commentary, of course, not understanding Southern Baptist polity, but they have very personal connections, either having had a child themselves through IVF or somebody they know. And so this is a highly personal and emotional issue without any doubt. And I think the resolution does a good job stating, if you look at the whole thing and you read the whole thing and try to understand the whole thing as it is, without any doubt, can be very difficult. Well, Jacob, we're going to wrap up with that. I appreciate your time today and spending some time with us as we've tried to highlight at least some of the issues that have been big issues during the convention. Thank you for being here.
No, thanks, Bobby. I appreciate the time.
Well, we're going to join together again as we look at a variety of other topics coming up in the future on the channel. Make sure and subscribe, like the channel as well, and it'll help kind of push the content out to other organizations and other individuals that would be interested. Thank you again for joining us.